Now, that was kind of an abstract, kind of a high level, kind of a Google I/O style presentation. That's a little more polished than you want to do all day long. Nice, but you know, we're developers. So let's take a look at some more developer level work, actual responsive design. So most of you said that you're using Bootstrap. Whoops, the camera people are saying don't walk in front of the screen. So most of you are using Bootstrap. But let's look at some other ways to think about responsive design, the way that Google's developers or designers think about it. So responsive design, right now what you're using are fixed width grids. So your screen is set to a fixed width, like 640. You divide it into 12 columns, so it's a fixed width grid. So one of the things we want to talk about here is fluid grids. Let's see. Oh, you have to be careful now. I have a laser gun. So fluid grids. Another thing is flexible images. We'll get into that in the next section, right? Can you pick the most appropriate image for the resolution of your screen or for the size of what you're building so that you don't have to load an enormous image for a small screen? And then finally, media queries, which you'll all be familiar with. Why responsive design? So we think a lot about responsive design in terms of different devices. But you also want to think about the different users. Is there a difference between a user on a small handheld phone and a tablet? Probably. Anybody who can afford a tablet probably has some different needs, some different requests. And so a lot of times developers think only about, well, how do I fit to this screen size? Maybe what you want to think about is, are there different feature sets for these different sizes of device based on the users that use them? Now, of course, the inverse problem of that is how many people have gone to a mobile site and it's completely not had the functionality you need for something. Airline sites are notorious for doing this. So do your research carefully to figure out what users really need. The habit is often just cut it down to what's going to fit on the screen. You actually have to do some user research. And then the last one is different data needs. Again, what if you have users in the countryside versus users here? And in fact, maybe there's a switch in your preferences that says, you know, I'm on Wi-Fi, turn on extra features. Or on my data plan, you know, enable advanced features with a note that says, this might cost you more to run. That's responsive design too. It's not just about the screen size. So progressive enhancement, right? I said this earlier. It's a common term. We've all heard it. I said it in response to the question of, well, can I polyfill service workers? What do I do? You still have to think in terms of progressive enhancement. You still have to build the simplest site first that'll work on most browsers. So I mean, most sites, that's just HTML. Now, nobody that you really need as a customer is using a terminal-based browser for HTML. Right? That was old days, you know, early 90s. So now you at least get HTML and CSS. But I mean, the way the browser works is, even if you only have HTML, it will still render something. If you have CSS support, it will add CSS styling. It's the same thing. This is progressively built, progressively rendered. And then if JavaScript is supported, add the JavaScript. One of the problems we see with a lot of modern single-page applications is if JavaScript is turned off or can't fully be loaded, the screen is blank. There's nothing interesting there. You should be designing when possible that your content is in HTML and the JavaScript adds functionality or takes over. And we'll talk about more of this when we talk about PWA architectures. So the first thing to know, and I apologize for the cough, I have a little bit of a cold, is that sizing things is the first thing you think about in responsive design. Sizing your elements matters. The very first rule of building a PWA, never make the user scroll horizontally. Up and down's fine. Sideways, don't make me look at you over my glasses. Just don't do it, right? Don't make users scroll horizontally. Now, thankfully, HTML renders itself fluidly to fit the viewport. Normally, you don't have to. But pictures, right? Pictures, tables, there are certain things that get fixed widths on them. Those are the things where you have to be careful to not get the user to scroll horizontally. So what can you do? One thing you can do is actually set the viewport meta tag, set the content, the width equal to the device width. So in most browsers, you may know this, most mobile browsers, there's actually a virtual viewport. On iOS, it's 960. I forget what it is on Android. It varies depending on the device and the release of Android. But basically, if you don't specify a viewport width, the browser makes up a virtual viewport that's something like 960, renders the page into it, and then shrinks it down. Well, in many cases, that's too small to read. It was a great hack for making desktop sites work on the browser. But that's, what, 9 years ago? 10 years ago? We can do better with one line of code. And always set this initial scale to be 1. Because of the browser auto-scaling, you get funny bugs, especially in iOS. If you rotate from portrait to landscape, your layouts can go completely wonky. If you set the initial scale like this and set the width to device width, it will always rescale to the size of the physical screen. Another trick in images is to set the maximum width of an image. In this case, max width 100%. And so in my CSS, if I say this image block is 300 pixels wide, the image that gets rendered in there will never be more than 300 pixels wide. It'll never go larger than 100% of the allocated space. Again, don't make users scroll horizontally. Pretty easy. And that works progressively. If a browser doesn't know what max width is, CSS just skips that line. Now, one thing we've talked about doing, I said, well, fixed size, you want fluid grids. But you need to think also, relative sizing is not really the total solution. If I build something with 10% margins and an 80% body, those margins are enormous on a desktop and they're tiny on mobile. So you do need to adapt to different device families. But this is something you're familiar with, right? This is not new responsive design, but we still have to say it. We have to set this up. So you can use media queries to select different layouts. On a small screen, maybe you have no margins, and everything's a single column. Then I turn that phone on its side. I go to landscape. And I rearrange so that this big element now takes up the whole screen width, and this second element moves down underneath it. And then my screen gets larger. Maybe it's a tablet. Now they can be side by side. So media queries can be used to select different layouts. And of course, most of you have seen this kind of example, designing where you say, OK, if this is 480 or smaller, lay it out for a phone. If this is 720 or smaller, lay it out for a tablet. But you really need to think about a much wider range of devices now than phones and tablets. And I would argue that device-based breakpoints are actually not the best way to go. This has been a long debate in the community, but Google is actually coming down more on the side of content-based breakpoints than device-based. So let's think about mobile-first design. So just start with in general queries by device. But this is not where you end. Think about one stream of content as your core design. So if I had no CSS, if I had just a small screen, can I arrange my content on the screen in a way that makes sense to somebody? Because sometimes you don't have a screen. Sometimes you don't have CSS. How many people have blind users? Visually impaired users? How many people have seen a screen reader in use? There's no CSS there. It's just text. So I'm going to take back something I said earlier. Nobody uses a browser for reading, but they may use a screen reader. So one stream of content that makes sense by itself is the way to go. And then for each device and viewport size, and I would say even for audiences, think about the best layout and then take blocks of content out of that stream and move them. Move them to the side, move them to the top, pin them to the top or the bottom, stretch them, maybe remove them or hide them. as needed for the needs of that audience and device. And what we recommend is, instead of fixed size device breakpoints, really match to content. So put your content on the screen and start resizing it and look at where it breaks naturally. And okay, sometimes you'll need a device-based breakpoint. If there's not a natural break under 420, then you probably have to put one in. But otherwise, try to add your major breakpoints based on where your content wraps nicely. And then use minor breakpoints for tuning. And you're really shooting for 70 to 80 characters per line. That's the optimal length for reading. And really what we're talking about here is content-based as opposed to device-based media queries. An example of mobile-first media queries, last time we were doing based on maximum width. So we were basically saying design for a desktop and then shrink it down to fit different devices. This is the other way around. Assume that you have a small stream of content, narrow, and then progressively enhance it as you get to larger devices using a min-width check. This is not new advice. Luke Roboleski said this one many, many years ago. But a lot of developers don't remember it. You can also use JavaScript. Now, this one's probably new. How many people have seen the window.matchMedia call? Anyone? One? Same person who's our designer. Cool. Window.matchMedia lets you inject a media query right there and find out, will it pass, will it match? So you can do media queries in JavaScript. Kind of a neat trick. So match media, pass it a query, and look at the matches property. It's like a regex. It returns an object that you can then evaluate repeatedly. And don't forget calc. Calc is another one. How many people have used calc in CSS? How many people think that calc is slow? It was. It used to be horrible. But the browsers have all gotten really fast. So in this case, I don't have to use something like SAS and calculate a fixed grid size when I start. I don't have to use JavaScript to figure out a grid size. I could say in my CSS, calculate the full width of this box minus 10 pixels and divide that by 2, and that's my width. That's pretty cool, right? I can actually now build half-screen columns with margins very, very easily. Now, if I'm going to use this, I better put a fallback width right above it that is a fixed width for browsers that don't know calc. But calc has been around a long time. So it's actually safe to use it. It's actually good to use. So content first, I mentioned briefly the techniques for manipulating the single stream of content. You can reorder things, pick them out of the DOM in one place and put them back in another using JavaScript. You can reposition. You can use float left, float right, position absolute, position relative to pick it out of the flow and put it where you want it. You could replace it. You could swap it out of the DOM and put a new thing in. Or use something like display none for one block and replace it with another one, make that visible, or remove it. But that's really a last resort. You're trying not to remove content. And again, think very carefully when you do this about accessibility. I know it's something a lot of developers don't like to think about because it can be hard to do, but it's important too. There is a really good course at Udacity on web accessibility. It's another free one. It was done by Rob Dodson, who did the accessibility for Polymer, and Alice Boxhall, who wrote the accessibility developer tools for Google. So great course. If you have any interest in accessibility, do take a look there. If you don't have an interest, take a look there anyway. Ultimately, though, you're trying to keep it as simple as possible. You're trying to help your users get to content. Remember, if they don't see their content they want within 10 seconds, that's load time plus the time it takes to look through the page to find it, they're gone. And for content, as your resolution changes, as your device type changes, you might pick a cropped image or a different image. One of the best tricks that I ever learned was to take big images and crop them, not just by cutting the edges off, but crop to the most important part. Crop for relevance without making it smaller. And then as you get more screen real estate, show more of the image progressively, or switch resolutions. Now, layout, the last thing. This is the last slide here. Then I'm going to have a little bit of lab practice for you. This class, by the way, we did a bunch of lecture this morning. That's not normal. The way this class is normally written is about 15 minutes a lecture, and then, if possible, I give you a lab. So a lot of hands-on time. So a lot of people use the 12-column grid, Bootstrap, Material Design Lite, fixed breakpoints, fixed device sizes. Easy and well understood, but it's not great for data usage because think about how many attributes you have to hang up on every item. And fixed widths. The recommended way, let me look ahead here. Nope. OK. What our designers recommend, and I guess the slide got deleted for this, is actually to design, think about your device families. For a small screen, build a single column grid. I mean, come on, that's easy. For a tablet style device, build maybe a 2-column grid, navigation and content. For a larger device like a desktop, build a 3-column grid. But build these in CSS. Use calc, use that relative sizing. It's not that difficult to do. Or if you need fixed width, use something like SAS that does the calculations for you. But don't use a general purpose 12-column grid. Build just the grid that you need for each device family. It's going to be much smaller CSS, and the markup is going to be much, much simpler. In many cases, your markup is, this is navigation, this is content. Or maybe for a 3-column device, this is content 1 and content 2. As opposed to, if you think about in Bootstrap, how many attributes are you adding to every single thing to make it work? That's a lot of stuff to transfer. If you build your own custom grid, you can fit it better to the device. You can build much smaller pages. And it's what our designers recommend, and it's not that hard to do. We use Bootstrap because it's easy, right? 5 minutes, you don't have to think about it. This one, might take you a day to get all those grids right, but then you've got them, and they're much better. So at the end of this section, there's a group of resources. This is also in your textbook, which I forgot to mention. So this course, we have the slide deck, we have lab instructions, we have some lab software on GitHub. We also give you a textbook. Because how many people leave the room and forget like half of what they learned? Right? On average, a week from now, you're only going to remember 25% of what we did. Now, the things that you do, you'll remember better. But you're not going to remember everything I said. Now, you can go back to YouTube and look. You can also look in the textbook. These same links will be in here. Whoops, hello. These same links will be in here, and explanations on how to do these things. So we wanted to make this course as useful as possible. So you'll have the video to study from, the slides, the labs, and a textbook, all free. OK, lab overview. Just simple stuff, but it's a nice warm-up. Whoops. So we'll give you a page, do some basic CS, set the viewport, style the page of CSS, set up breakpoints, set up a grid layout. And then if you have a little extra time, there's a section of lab on Flexbox. Now, I didn't go into the Flexbox and grid layout details here because we're condensing this class today. But Flexbox is a new, much nicer way to lay out your pages. And the lab will actually give you practice using it. OK, so go ahead and grab the responsive design lab from your notes. Everybody should have had the link to the main folder, and there's an agenda in there. Open the agenda. There's a link to the lab. So, and everybody brought machines, it looks like, so go for it.